Hi, my name is Miranda Vaughn. I am the Reference and Archives Librarian at the Mississippi Library Commission, and today we are going to talk about unlocking primary sources. So if you come here and you don't really have a background in history or historical research, you're not really comfortable looking at those dusty old documents that people may bring in from their grandparents' attic, have no fear. You have come to the right place. This is one of my favorite things to talk about as a historian myself. So I'm very excited to share some of my tips and tricks and secrets on how to interpret these sources that may be a little bit intimidating at first. So let's get started. So first of all, what are primary sources? Well, they're basically firsthand accounts of a topic from the people who have a direct connection with it. So that's a little bit of a vague description of it, I guess. I think it's a little bit easier to understand what primary sources are by giving you some examples. If you have some examples, maybe you can kind of get what they are. So for example, you have texts of laws and other original documents so these are created during the time period for the time period in which they are created. Newspaper reports can be primary sources if they're by reporters who witnessed an event or if they quote people who did. Again, in context of the time period in which they're created. Speeches, diaries, letters, interviews, anything like that that's considered a firsthand account, what the people involved said or what they wrote. Original research is also considered a primary source. Data sets, survey data, things like the census, any kind of economic statistics like that, that are, kind of created from scratch. Again, firsthand accounts. Also, visuals like photographs and videos, and also audio recordings or things like oral histories. Those can also be primary sources. So if you have primary sources, it's kind of a given that you most likely will have secondary sources as well. So if you understand what secondary sources are, that can also kind of help you figure out what primary sources are as well. Secondary sources are one step removed from the primary source. So they often quote the primary source. They may use them for research to create whatever the secondary source is. They can cover the same topic, but they add a layer of interpretation and analysis. And keep those two words in mind as we go throughout this presentation, because those are what we're going to call keywords or vocabulary words, if you will, that will continuously pop up when it comes to figuring out what is a primary source versus a secondary source. So secondary sources commonly are textbooks, books about a topic, so like biographies or any nonfiction books that are written about the topic at hand. Textbooks are kind of like a go-to easy one that's pretty much always going to be a secondary source. Again, any kind of analysis or interpretation of data. This can often be scholarly or other articles about a topic, especially by people who weren't directly involved. And then this one right here, you may not expect, because usually the content they contain is very informative, and they contain a lot of content that is actually primary sources or are primary sources, but documentaries, they are considered secondary sources. Again, they often include photos and videos that can be considered primary sources, but they themselves are not. They are secondary sources. So here are a few primary versus secondary source examples that may give you a little bit more insight into what exactly these are. So a novel, like a work of fiction, or any kind of original artwork or original creation like that is going to be considered a primary source. So a novel, a painting, things like that, primary sources. A secondary source to complement that would be an article analyzing the novel. So you're going to use information from the novel, you're going to reference the novel, you're going to cite it, but it's not going to be an original creation. It's going to be a secondhand account of that novel. Same thing with a painting. If you have an exhibition catalog, like in a museum or something, that explains the painting, again, it's going to reference the painting, but that is considered a secondary source. Letters and diaries written by a historical figure, those things are going to be that figure's personal account, their personal written created material. But a biographer may use those letters and diaries to write a biography about that historical figure. And again, it will reference those letters, it will reference those diaries, but the biography itself is just an analysis or an interpretation of those things. So it is a secondary source. So you may be getting the picture now. If you have an essay by a philosopher versus the textbook summarizing the philosopher's idea, again, as I said before, textbooks are kind of like real simple, easy, easy answers when you're looking for lists of secondary sources. Textbooks are pretty much always going to be secondary sources. Photographs of a historical event versus a documentary about that historical event. And then government documents about a policy versus a newspaper article about that new policy. So, I had mentioned before that sometimes newspaper articles can be primary sources. This is where you have to kind of question it and figure out, are they or are they not? Because in this instance, they would be an interpretation of what actually is the primary source. So just keep that in mind. So a lot of people will ask the question, well, which is better? Which should I use, primary sources or secondary sources? And the answer is, it depends. Context is key. It depends on what you're looking for. It depends on what you're researching. If you're needing a really in-depth analysis of something, you're needing to kind of get down to the basics, I guess, of what the issue is or what the topic is, and really take a deep dive into it, then you're probably going to need to go with primary sources and interpret them yourself. Because what happens when you get to a secondary source is there's kind of a filter that's put on them. So you're getting the content that is in that primary source, but it's through the filter of whoever created the secondary source. And that's great sometimes. Sometimes you need that perspective. If you're just needing a quick overview, for sure, it's good to just go ahead and get a secondary source. But typically a primary source is going to have the original content. And if that's what you're needing is the original content with no biases attached and no filters attached, then you're going to need to go to the primary source. So basically just ask yourself, what is it that I need to get out of this? What information am I trying to get? And put everything in context and then go from there. So let's do a little activity to kind of get you thinking based on what we talked about so far with primary sources versus secondary source. I have a few items here that I want you to see if you can figure out if these are primary sources or secondary sources. So first we have this biography of Princess Diana. It's called Diana, Her True Story in Her Own Words. And it was written by Andrew Morton, published in 1997. So what do we think this is, primary or secondary? Well, if you guessed secondary, then you guessed correctly. As I said before, books about a subject, biographies, things like that, they are considered secondary sources. While I'm sure this biographer uses interviews with Diana, uses maybe some of her letters and diaries and whatnot, her things that are primary sources, the author and the creator of this piece or this item is not Diana. So it is his account of her and of her documents and whatnot. So this is considered a secondary source. Now, sticking with the theme of Princess Diana, This is an interview with Princess Diana with BBC. This is an interview transcript from November 1995. So based on what we talked about, do we think this is a primary source or a secondary source? Well, if you answered primary, then you answered correctly. This is a primary source. Why? Because these are the exact words of Diana. This is the exact transcript of the original recording. And you may think, well, this isn't the original recording. This is just a transcript of that recording. So does that make it a secondary source? No, it doesn't, because it doesn't do what? Analyze or interpret that. This is just the written form of that original audio or video recording. So this is basically, just think of it as like, this is the same thing, but it's just in a different format. And that doesn't make it a different type of source. It just puts the original source in a different format, but it's still a primary source. And this one, I thought this one was really interesting. Maybe a little bit more difficult. This is an American Red Cross first aid textbook, and it's from 1937. So, do you think this one is primary or secondary? Well, this one is actually a little bit tricky, because this is going to go back to what I said about context being key, context being everything. This, I would say, is a primary or a secondary source, depending on the context, especially because of the fact that it is so old, and because of the content that's in it. It was made in 1937, and this is a book about first aid techniques. Most likely over the past 80 plus years, first aid techniques have changed a little bit. We've advanced in science and learned more things. So it's not the most up-to-date textbook. So while it is a textbook, which, as we said before, most of the time are secondary sources, if it is used as a textbook, then yes, it is a secondary source. But if someone is coming in, and if you have this textbook and someone is coming into your library and they're researching, what old textbooks said about first aid, or they're researching, medical practices from the early 1900s, they can use this as a primary source, not necessarily because it gives them updated information, but because the way it was written and the person who created it or the entity that created it, it can be considered a primary source because of that. So it just kind of depends on what you're researching and what you're using it for, because it can be considered a primary or secondary source based on what you need it to, what its function is going to be. So now that we've talked a little bit about primary sources and what they are and how to identify them, let's talk about how to interpret them and to unlock the information that is in them. So what I like to do is to start with the famous 5 W's: who, what, when, where, and why. This is just an easy way to go about it. When you have a document in front of you, ask yourself these questions in order to get yourself started with analyzing the document. So first we ask ourselves who created this? This is where, when you're interpreting or when you're reading primary sources, you're not just reading and interpreting the information that is in those sources, as in the written information itself, but you are interpreting kind of the history of the source as a whole, about like the object itself, the item itself, its history, and the way it was created and the purpose for which it was created. So you ask yourself, who created this? Who is the author? What entity created this? And also, who is the intended audience? Is this a letter from someone to their friend, or is this a letter from someone to their employer? Because although both of those letters may cover the same topic, the way that the letter is written is going to be different for a letter to a friend versus a letter to an employer. The language is going to be a little bit different. The details that are included may be a little bit different. So you have to think about who created it and who they created it for. And then also, what information does this convey? This is where, of course, you do have to analyze the information that's in it. What does this letter say? What does this photograph show? What can I tell by just looking at this and reading over it, or scanning this photo or watching this video? What can I get from the information that's conveyed? Then when was this created? What was the time period in which it was created? Was it created, is this a letter to a friend about, this, this Adolf Hitler, who has taken control in Germany before the war or after the war? Because the story is going to be a little bit different. There's a lot of events. If it was created before World War II, or at just the rise of Adolf Hitler, then some of the content's going to be a little bit different than once you get to 1945 or something. So think about when it was created and put that into context as well. And also, where was it created? Was it created, a document created in North Korea during the Cold War is going to look different than a document created in the United States, because those are two different perspectives on the same subject, but two different perspectives. So think about that too. That all goes back to what the purpose of this is, what the purpose of this item is, the purpose of this diary entry, whatever it may be. And then last, why? Why was this created? Was this created, just to give entertainment to your close-knit group of friends? Or was this created to, try to start a revolution with, a local activist group? What is the reason for the author creating this? So let's get to a little practice here and give you a little bit of an example with an actual document. This is a letter from the Columbus Lowndes Public Library's collection of Robert E. Hunt family papers. This is available on the Mississippi Digital Library website. So let's just, at first glance, we can see a lot of these questions are going to be really easy to answer. We have a letter that is signed by the author, addressed to the audience, the intended audience. So immediately we have the who taken care of. And then, of course, it's on a letterhead. So we can assume that the person who wrote this must be a part of Columbus Public Schools. We can assume that it is probably not just a casual letter to a friend. It's probably more of an official letter, since it is on a letterhead. It contains a date, so we know when it was created, May 25th, 1962. We know where it was created because we have addresses here that we can, just assume that was created in Columbus or somewhere around Columbus, Mississippi. And that's all just kind of like at first glance. And then once you actually read into the body of the letter, then you get even more information. You can see that clearly this Mr. Robert E. Hunt, or he's addressed as Professor Hunt, seems to be retiring, leaving the school system. And this is a letter just kind of thanking him for his service, wishing him well, recalling good times or things that he contributed that's going to be missed. But it is a professional letter. And so, but you can tell by reading this that clearly this is not Mr. Hunt's first year teaching. Clearly, based on the information here, he's been around for a little while. So if you have someone who is, researching teachers in Columbus Public Schools or teachers in Mississippi, they might be interested in looking at this letter and seeing more about Mr. Hunt and looking more into his family papers. But that's just an example of how you can just look at the item and go through and ask yourself the 5 W's, and kind of come up with basically a history of this document without even knowing without having any kind of context outside of just this one letter. And so obviously, once you've answered those questions, then you as a researcher can know where you need to go next. And as a librarian or someone who's helping a researcher, then you can kind of point them in the right direction as well, based on the information that you got just from this one letter. And again, you can do this with photographs, with diaries, with any kind of primary source. It's just a matter of interpreting it yourself, so that you kind of become the secondary source. You interpret and you do the analyzing. And so it's just an easy thing to do, to start with the who, what, when, where, and why. So one kind of stumbling block that you may run into sometimes with primary sources, depending on how old they are, depending on how far removed you are from the time period that the sources were created in, sometimes language can be a barrier. We all know that language changes constantly, just even from generation to generation. Different terms mean different things. We start as a society using terms to describe different groups of people and things like that. And that sort of thing changes over time. So it's important in your journey to unlock primary sources to have a little bit of background in how to also unlock the language that's in these primary sources. And so I think this is kind of a fun thing to do, a little resource, I guess, that you can use is called a Soundex, like an index, but a Soundex. And if you've ever done, especially any family history research, genealogy research, or anything like that, where you're having to look up people's last names or names of people just in general, you might find that, especially looking at like census records and things like that, last names can be spelled a million different ways. Even if you didn't know it, they can. And so sometimes that becomes a real barrier to finding the information you need. If you look at one record and a person's last name is Smith and it's spelled S-M-I-T-H. And then another record, it's the same person, but their name is spelled S-M-Y-T-H. Or maybe there's an E on the end, or there's some variation of that spelling. That may be the same person that you're looking for. It's just a different spelling. And if you're still looking for S-M-I Smith, and the person you're looking for is actually in S-M-Y Smith, then you might miss them, or you might just assume it's not the same person when it actually is. So the Soundex is a tool that was created to kind of help you when you're looking for those last names that might have multiple different spellings. Instead of looking for that specific spelling, you can use these Soundex codes, and they are more encompassing of multiple spellings of the same name. So here's how it works. I've added a little screenshot from the National Archives that explains it a little bit better than I did. But basically what happens is you take the surname, the last name, and you use the first letter of the last name. So for instance, we'll just use my last name, Vaughn, V-A-U-G-H-N. So the first letter of my last name is V. So the first letter of my Soundex code will be V. Then you're gonna have that first letter followed by 3 numbers. And you look at the letters in the assigned code that I put here to figure out what those numbers are gonna be. So first of all, you skip the vowels. Take all the vowels out. The vowels are no more. Vowels and the consonants W, H, and sometimes Y. Those are all assigned the code of 0. So we don't include them at all. We skip whatever vowels and we go straight to the next consonant. So we're going to skip A and we're going to skip U, and then we're going to go straight to G. And if you look on the assigned code, you find the letter G. The number that's assigned is a 2. So that's the second digit in your Soundex code, in my Soundex code. Then H, as we said, H has that 0 as well. So we're going to skip the H and we're going to go to the next consonant, which is an N. And if you look on the code, the N is the number 5. So that's going to be our second one. Now, clearly we've run out of letters at this point. So since you have to have 3 numbers following that first letter, we're just going to put a 0 in to fill in the space. Okay, so that means that my Soundex code is V250. Now, I think it's kind of fun to figure out, figure out the code for different last names and stuff. But if you don't want to do that, if you just want to skip it and just be like, let me type in my name, let them give me the code, I don't feel like playing this little game, then you can actually go to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History's website, to their catalog. And on the first page of their catalog, down here where it has additional research tools, if you go to tools, they have a Soundex helper. And there are other websites that have this too. I believe that the National Archives has a Soundex helper as well. But for us Mississippians, let's use MDAH. So if you click on the Soundex helper, all you have to do is type in the name. Mine's already there. And then just do get Soundex code. And there it is. That's what we came up with, V250. That is the Soundex code for the name Vaughn. And that will include multiple spellings of Vaughn, and it'll make it easier for me to be able to find a family member or whoever it is that I'm looking for with the last name Vaughn, even if it's not spelled exactly like I spell it. So that can be very helpful, especially for genealogy people. So keep that in your back pocket. Also, if you're like me and you don't really have much of a military background, don't really have family members that are in the military or close family members, wasn't, raised really understanding all of the military terms and things, sometimes interpreting military records can be a little difficult, and you kind of need like a dictionary nearby. So what I've done is just included a few terms here that you may find if you're looking for old military records. Some of these are still used, but specifically old military records. And if you're not super familiar with military terms, these are just a few examples of terms that you may come across when researching those records. So first, you have muster rolls. This is an official list of officers and men in a military unit or in a ship's company. And these muster rolls usually contain a good bit of information. Of course, they contain the officer's name, the name of their station and rank, all of that, with the date they enlisted, but also if they deserted or had any kind of were court-martialed or anything like that, all that information will be there as well. Then you have the term bounty land, which is land given to an individual as a reward for military service. This may come up in historical military records. Infantry versus cavalry. Some of you may be watching this like, oh, of course I know what that is. I included this because this is something that I sometimes forget the difference between the two. So for those of you who may, again, be like me and forget the difference, infantry are foot soldiers. And so, just on foot, no horses or anything. Cavalry was the units with the horses. So today, I don't really ride horses anymore, but today the equivalent would be like helicopters, tanks, pretty much any vehicular whatever. Back in the day, of course, it was pretty much just horses. If you're in the Civil War in Mississippi, you might have had a few camels. Just a little fun fact for you. Yeah, so pretty much infantry, foot soldiers, cavalry, rode horses. that's pretty much all you have to remember. But this can be very helpful if you're trying to figure out like what regiment or unit the person you're trying to find is in. It's important to know like where the infantry or cavalry. So that can be helpful. Militia. Also, we don't really have militias nowadays in America. What would be considered or what militias evolved into over time was basically what our National Guard is now. But what they originally were basically volunteer armies, civil armies, so non-military. From the non-military population. They were created to supplement the regular army. And these were just more common back before the United States military was like super established like it is now. So like in some of the early American wars, you will find more information about militias. But like I said, now pretty much the same role has been taken over by the National Guard, or what they've evolved into is the National Guard. And I also included just a little snapshot from familysearch.org. They had a great resource that shows you when the different, like when the Army and the different military companies and all that were established. So that way you just get an idea of what time frame you're looking at when you're looking at these records. Also, primary sources, a lot of times you're going to come across things like court records. You don't really have to have professional training in Latin or anything like that, but a lot of legal terms have Latin bases. So it might help to kind of have a little Latin dictionary or something there with you if you're going through a lot of legal documentation that has a lot of Latin in it. But I've just included a few terms here that you might run across when looking at old court records and legal documentations. A lot of these pertain to wills and deeds and that sort of thing. So first of all, we have calendars, which is not like the calendar that we think of with the dates and all that. It's a summary of documents or a list of court cases. You also have folios, which is a large size book in a courthouse or archives. The one leaf of these folios is a book, one leaf is 2 pages, and the right page is called a recto and the left page is called a verso. Now this sounds very tedious, but you will see documentation that refers to recto or verso. And just so you know what that is the left and the right of one leaf in a folio. And then we have codicils, which are additions or supplements to a will that changes the provisions of the will. And then a few more terms that kind of relate to wills and deeds. We have testate and the testator, which is the creation of a valid will before the person dies. And the person who created it is the testator. And then the executor or the executor or the executrix, that's male or female. Executrix is the female, executor is the male, are the ones who execute the will on behalf of the person. Intestate is when the person has died and did not make a valid will. And so you have a couple of terms that you'll see. The administrator in that situation would be kind of like the executor for the testate will. And then legacies are, of course, gifts or money or personal property that's left in the will. Lis pendens is one of those Latin terms. It means a pending lawsuit. Nuncupative will is an oral will. So it's spoken, not written. And then you also have, to kind of go along with these, land records. So some of the terms that you might often see with land records are appurtenances, which are rights and duties attached to land. Infef is a term often found in deeds. It refers to transferring of land from one person to the purchaser or granting authority over land to someone else. Entail is a restricted inheritance of land to an individual person. or a group. Grantee versus grantor. Grantee is the buyer of the property. Grantor is the seller. Hereditaments are it's property passed down through inheritance. So hereditaments. Messuage is a large house with surrounding land. And meets and bounds is a way that they used to, it was a survey system that they used to use for identifying creeks and trees and other natural features. And then we also have societal language that, again, changes a lot over time, especially when it comes to like race and ethnicity. As I mentioned before, in like census records and things like that, anything where they would include the race of a person. You a lot of times will see an M for mulatto, which would be a mixed race person, black and white. And then depending on what time period it is, I think mostly in the Jim Crow South, especially on the census records, instead of putting a B for black, if the person was black, they would put an N for Negro. So things like that is important to pay attention to, especially with the census records and stuff. If you're like, I don't know what this letter is for, I don't know, what race this is supposed to be. Those are two that are commonly used that you might be able to decipher. And also familial language, things like illegitimate children. Sometimes they're referred to as just illegitimate, and sometimes they're called baseborn. So those are two terms that you might see used interchangeably. A relict is a word that's used usually in a person's will to refer to the widow of the deceased person. Then you also have né, which is a French term that is used before someone's maiden name. So you have, like for instance, Diana Windsor is Princess Diana's married name, Diana Windsor, but her maiden name was Spencer. So her name would be Diana Windsor, née Spencer. That's used a lot. That's used a lot in like English terms. Maybe you might not see it as much with American documents. And then cousin is one of those that it may be an actual cousin, or it can often be either a niece or a nephew. They use that word interchangeably with niece and nephew. And then just a few more terms that you might see. Annic is, it means and in the year. So sometimes you might see that in place of and in the year. Bands and bonds are pretty common. Bands are an announcement of marriage, and usually this is found just in church records. They're not like legally binding or anything. They're more like for religious purposes. And then bonds are the actual marriage contract. And actually here on the screen, I have a copy of a marriage ban from the old parish registers from the National Records of Scotland. So this is church records. They kept this a ban for this couple. And then, of course, immigration versus immigration. A minor often was under 21 years of age. We might think of it today as 18 years of age, but in some historical records, the minor would be considered under 21. Esquire, we still see this today. It's a title of courtesy after a man's name, kind of like Mr. or Reverend. It's just put at the end of their name. Imprimis, I believe is how you say that. It means in the first place. It's often used before a list in a will or before an inventory of some sort. Indenture, this can be a contract of servitude. That's probably where we're most familiar with it, but it can also be a land deed. Liber or libro is a book or a volume. And then yeoman is a land-owning farmer. So in some of these, you might come across, some of them may be specific to certain regions of the United States or Europe. So just so that you're aware, if you come across some of those are some of the meanings for those. And then last, I want to talk a little bit about unlocking handwriting, because this can also be a real stumbling block when it comes to interpreting primary sources. Beware the dreaded shorthand. I think it's really funny. We talk a lot about how text messaging and using shortened terms through text messaging is like ruining us as a society, with making us come across as less educated and all that. But the truth is, shorthand, abbreviations, you know, but all that good nonsense has been around for centuries. It's just taken on different forms over time. And I can't be too judgmental, because if you're thinking about back in the day when they had ink wells and quills to write with, I would probably be shortening everything I could as well. So here are a few terms that kind of encompass what techniques and things were used for shorthand in handwriting. A ligature is where two or more letters or characters are joined together to form one letter or character. For example, two S's together, instead of writing S and S, they just form one collective letter. CH, TH, some of those letters that you see used together a lot, they'll also have them sometimes as just one letter. Or a ligature. It wouldn't be considered a letter, it would be a ligature. Superscript is a letter, word, or symbol written above a letter or word or line of script. Usually it's the last letter of the word. So that's like if you don't want to write the full word out, you'll just write the first couple of letters and then add the superscript at the top. That's usually going to be the last letter of the word, and hope that people can figure it out. Then you have serif. That's a short cross stroke at the top or bottom of a sender or descender letter. So ascender letters would be like, essentially, I'm sure this isn't the technical term, but I always say letters with a tail. So either a tail going up like a B or a D, or a tail going down like a P or a Y or a G. So ascending letters, the tail goes up, descending letters, the tail goes down. And so there might be some sort of stroke through them, and that indicates missing letters of some sort. And then suspension is the end of a word, if the end of the word is abbreviated or if the final letters of the word are missing. Sometimes it's like they just start writing the word and then they're like, I'm done. So they'll just throw in a colon or some sort of other symbol to be like, you know, I'm sorry, I'm done with this word, figure it out on your own. So to give you an idea of what some of these look like, here are a list of proper names, and I'll leave it up for a second to see if, or you can pause the video and see if you can guess what these names are based on the handwriting and some of the things that we just talked about. So here we go. How'd you do? Some of them you can kind of guess. I feel like Mississippi is pretty obvious. Tennessee is pretty obvious. The first name is Clarissa, and then you have Susanna. And again, you can see here that ligature where there were two S's and they just combined them and made them one letter or one ligature. Massachusetts, of course, they abbreviated it, but it has that one ligature. Mississippi, Tennessee, the name Ross there at the top right-hand corner. August looks a little funny, so August doesn't have the two S's, but that's just the one S there. Then Missouri and Charles. Charles cracked me up because there's no way on earth I would have known that was Charles had I not known anything about superscripts. Because what happened, as you can see, is they started writing the name, so they put the C and the H, and then left out everything in between and made the final S in the name a superscript. But if you were living back during the time period where this was common, that might be nothing to you. You might look at that and be like, oh, that's Charles. So, but it can be kind of a culture shock for those of us in modern times, since we don't write that way anymore. Here's another list of names that I thought was interesting. There are multiple spellings of Elizabeth, Eliza, Elizabeth there on the left-hand column. Then you have a couple of Isaacs, a couple of Jeremiahs, you have a Joshua, Joseph, and that last one, again, I would not have known. This one was very difficult for me to figure out, but it's Jesse. And again, you can see the two S's form the one letter and make it Jesse. And then finally here we have on the left, we have some examples of the way that the months of the year have been written. Some of them are shorthand, some of them are longer. You can kind of see how the letters have changed and gone back and forth over time. And then on the right, we have some more proper names and abbreviations, as well as things like, if you look at the right-hand column, about halfway down, you see church is just a C and an H with a line through it. Continued is like a C and a D with a line through, like a superscript D with a line through it is what it looks like. So some of these, you know, probably within context, if you were living during the time that this was common, you would look at that and immediately know that that's what that stood for. But for those of us in modern times, you really have to know a little bit about the history of handwriting to be able to interpret that sort of thing. But these charts can be very helpful. And I wanted to say also, I'll bring this up a little bit later. Most of the handwriting things that I showed you, I got from this book called Reading Early American Handwriting by Kip Sperry. It has a lot of really good stuff in it. So I'll mention it again before we get done here. So I know that this has been a lot of information, but just a few takeaways when it comes to primary sources. Just quick definition, just think of them as firsthand accounts. Secondary sources, think of them as, I mean, you can think of them as secondhand accounts if you want to. That might be a little confusing, but just remember those keywords that I told you: interpreting and analyzing things, citing primary sources. Look for those. Ask yourself if the source does those things, and it might be a secondary source if it does. Can sources be primary and secondary? Yes. And what did I say? Context is key, and you have to think about the context in which you are researching these things, and it's always key. You can interpret primary sources by, again, looking at the document or the item as a whole, not just looking at the information that's in it, not just looking at the words that are written on the paper, but looking at the document as a whole and the history of the document as a whole and the history of its creation. Ask yourself the 5 W's: who, what, when, where, why. And then also ask yourself, what place does this document or record or item have in the context of the subject that I'm studying? Because again, context is key. And also, don't forget to use your dictionaries and thesauruses and your Oxford English dictionaries. In fact, if you have access to us here at MLC, if you have a library card with us, you can access the Oxford English Dictionary online through us. And you can even use people as resources for things like language and handwriting. That could be a great way for librarians to engage some of their older patrons by talking to them a little bit about maybe the language that was used for a couple of generations removed, you know. Talk to them about handwriting that we may not recognize today, but they might recognize from, you know, earlier in the 1900s or something. So that could be a fun way to engage older patrons. And also, just wanted to leave you guys with a few resources. The Kate Turabian, this one actually may be an older copy. This was from my undergraduate days, so this is the 7th edition, but this is a manual for writers by Kate Turabian. This is a history student's Bible, pretty much. So there's a lot of things about writing history papers in here and researching and all that. So it's a good resource to keep. Again, Reading Early American Handwriting, we have this here at MLC. So if you have a library card with us, you can check it out. It has a lot of good stuff. It was like a lot of the content that I got for this presentation, I got out of here. So I will definitely be keeping this on hand as well. Also, some digital resources that are really good that you can just access from home. FamilySearch.org has a lot of guides and things that can help you with different types of primary sources and how to read them. There are also a lot of universities out there who have LibGuides that you can access online. You just do a quick Google search for interpreting primary sources. That's what I did. And I found several good LibGuides from different universities. You can also check out the Library of Congress website. They have a section on interpreting primary sources. And the last thing that I wanted to show you that I thought is a really good resource, especially for our librarians out there and even teachers too. If there are any teachers that might be watching this, if you go to the NARA website, the National Archives and Records Administration website, they have these really cool worksheets that you can do. You can do yourself, or if you have students, or if you're hosting some sort of workshop at your library, you can use these PDFs. They have ones for younger students and for people who maybe have like English as a second language. They have Spanish versions. They have ones for intermediate and secondary students as well. And you can just click on whatever type of document or type of item you want, and it gives you these worksheets that kind of walk you through how to interpret them by asking you questions and having little boxes that you can check off and do little activities and stuff. That, like, there's one for photographs, there's one for written documents, things like maps, videos, all different types of formats. And so that can be really, really helpful. If you look at the ones that are for the younger students, they have pictures and like cute graphics and stuff. Anyway, I think this would be a lot of fun to do in a workshop with kids, teens, even adults, you know. So I encourage you to check that out. And also at the bottom here, I have my contact information as well as the contact information for our reference services department here at the Library Commission. If you have questions about this webinar, I know this was a lot of information, but there's so much more that I could add. So I would be happy to send you more resources if you would like. Just feel free to reach out to me or reach out to our reference staff. We're always willing to help. So thank you so much for tuning in, and best of luck to you in unlocking your primary sources.